Fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria. Introductory note by Peter Gay. In the course of his career as the first psychoanalyst, Freud presented in his published writings a good many vignettes from his clinical material. Many of them, though not explicitly mentioned, form the backdrop of and enrich his papers and monographs. It was not until he began to write speculative and comprehensive essays on religion and culture just before the First World War, starting with Totem and Taboo in 1913 and concluding with Civilization and its Discontents in 1930, that he left the couch behind. Indeed, among his voluminous writings, his case histories loom large as expositions of the varieties of mental suffering amenable to psychoanalytic treatment, and as instances of his technique, both successful and unsuccessful. Freud designed these subtle, beautifully designed reports, and they continue to work after all these years, as didactic devices of the first order. They remain impressive and highly useful, even though later generations of psychoanalysts, freely employing the material that Freud offered them, have reanalyzed these cases and come to conclusions often at variance with Freud's own. The famous and controversial Dora case is the first of Freud's 5 major case histories. Like the other 4, Little Hans, the Ratman, Schreber, and the Wolfman, it bears a sober technical title, Fragment of an Analysis of a Case of Hysteria, but has since been known to the world under a nickname. Dora, her real name was Ida Bauer, went into analysis with Freud as an 18-year-old in October 1900 and abruptly ended her treatment 11 weeks later. Freud wrote up the case quickly in January 1901, but did not publish it for a variety of reasons, alluded to but not completely explained in the Prefatory remarks, until 1905. As the provisional title of the case, Dreams and Hysteria, indicates, Freud had intended his exposition as an adjunct to his interpretation of dreams that would exhibit, in a concrete instance, the uses of dream interpretation. But, more consequential for the history of psychoanalysis, the case history was, as Freud acknowledges, the record of a failure. Accordingly, in the concluding passages, he draws a lesson from that failure. He had been seriously remiss in not paying sufficient attention to his patient's transference on him. Dora had bestowed on him, her analyst, some of her most passionate feelings, at once amorous and furious. What is more, he had failed to appreciate the homosexual current in Dora's loves, because he had not yet been fully aware of the share that homosexual urges play in neuroses. But Freud's critics have gone far beyond this. In the polemical feminist literature of the 1960s and beyond, Freud, the analyst of Dora, has been charged with still another failure, the striking inability to set aside his male prejudices, a lack of empathy with a suffering adolescent girl being victimized by egoistic adults, including her father. There is a good deal to this charge, but Freud's attitude toward Dora remains susceptible to varying assessments, including his disappointment at his inability to keep Dora in analysis, and his habit of those days to push interpretations on his analysans, the men, too. What is demonstrated is that, as he had with his so-called seduction theory, so again with Dora, Freud was learning from his mistakes. After Dora, psychoanalytic technique was never the same. Prefatory remarks. In 1895 and 1896, I put forward certain views upon the pathogenesis of hysterical symptoms and upon the mental processes occurring in hysteria. Since that time, several years have passed. In now proposing, therefore, to substantiate those views by giving a detailed report of the history of the case and its treatment, I cannot avoid making a few introductory remarks, for the purpose partly of justifying, from various standpoints, the step I am taking, and partly of diminishing the expectations to which it will give rise. No doubt it was awkward that I was obliged to publish the results of my inquiry without there being any possibility of other workers in the field testing and checking them, particularly as those results were of a surprising and by no means gratifying character. But it will be scarcely less awkward now that I am beginning to bring forward some of the material upon which my conclusions were based, and make it accessible to the judgment of the world. I shall not escape blame by this means. Only, whereas before I was accused of giving no information about my patients, now I shall be accused of giving information about my patients which ought not to be given. I can only hope that in both cases the critics will be the same, and that they will merely have shifted the pretext for their reproaches. If so, I can resign in advance any possibility of ever removing their objections. Even if I ignore the ill will of narrow-minded critics such as these, the presentation of my case histories remains a problem which is hard for me to solve. The difficulties are partly of a technical kind, but are partly due to the nature of the circumstances themselves. If it is true that the causes of hysterical disorders are to be found in the intimacies of the patient's psychosexual life, and that hysterical symptoms are the expression of their most secret and repressed wishes, then the complete elucidation of the case of hysteria is bound to involve the revelation of those intimacies and the betrayal of those secrets. It is certain that the patients would never have spoken if it had occurred to them that their admissions might possibly be put to scientific uses. And it is equally certain that to ask them themselves for leave to publish their case would be quite unavailing. In such circumstances, persons of delicacy, as well as those who are merely timid, would give first place to the duty of medical discretion, and would declare with regret that the matter was one upon which they could offer science no enlightenment. But in my opinion, the physician has taken upon himself duties not only towards the individual patient, but towards science as well. And his duties towards science mean ultimately nothing else than his duties towards the many other patients who are suffering or will someday suffer from the same disorder. Thus it becomes the physician's duty to publish what he believes he knows of the causes and structure of hysteria, and it becomes a disgraceful piece of cowardice on his part to neglect doing so, as long as he can avoid causing direct personal injury to the single patient concerned. I think I have taken every precaution to prevent my patient from suffering any such injury. I have picked out a person, the scenes of whose life were laid not in Vienna, but in a remote provincial town, and whose personal circumstances must therefore be practically unknown in Vienna. I have from the very beginning kept the fact of her being under my treatment such a careful secret that only one other physician, and one in whose discretion I have complete confidence, Wilhelm Fliess, can be aware that the girl was a patient of mine. I have waited for 4 whole years since the end of the treatment and have postponed publication till hearing that a change has taken place in the patient's life of such a character as allows me to suppose that her own interest in the occurrences and psychological events which are to be related here may now have grown faint. Needless to say, I have allowed no name to stand which could put a non-medical reader upon the scent, and the publication of the case in a purely scientific and technical periodical should, further, avoid a guarantee against unauthorized readers of this sort. I naturally cannot prevent the patient herself from being pained if her own case history should accidentally fall into her hands, but she will learn nothing from it that she does not already know, and she may ask herself who besides her could discover from it that she is the subject of this paper. I am aware that, in this city at least, there are many physicians who, revolting though it may seem, choose to read a case history of this kind not as a contribution to the psychopathology of the neuroses, but as a roman à clef designed for their private delectation. I can assure readers of this species that every case history which I may have occasion to publish in the future will be secured against their perspicacity by similar guarantees of secrecy, even though this resolution is bound to put quite extraordinary restrictions upon my choice of material. Now, in this case history, the only one which I have hitherto succeeded in forcing through the limitations imposed by medical discretion and unfavorable circumstances, sexual questions will be discussed with all possible frankness. The organs and functions of sexual life will be called by their proper names, and the pure-minded reader can convince himself from my description that I have not hesitated to converse upon such subjects in such language even with a young woman. Am I, then, to defend myself upon this score as well? I will simply claim for myself the rights of the gynecologist, or rather much more modest ones, and add that it would be the mark of a singular and perverse prurience to suppose that conversations of this kind are a good means of exciting or of gratifying sexual desires. For the rest, I feel inclined to express my opinion on this subject in a few borrowed words. It is deplorable to have to make room for protestations and declarations of this sort in a scientific work, but let no one reproach me on this account, but rather accuse the spirit of the age, owing to which we have reached a state of things in which no serious book can any longer be sure of survival. Schmidt, 1902, Preface. I will now describe the way in which I have overcome the technical difficulties of drawing up the report of this case history. The difficulties are very considerable when the physician has to conduct 6 or 8 psychotherapeutic treatments of the sort in a day, and cannot make notes during the actual session with the patient for fear of shaking the patient's confidence and of disturbing his own view of the material under observation. Indeed, I have not yet succeeded in solving the problem of how to record for publication the history of a treatment of long duration. As regards the present case, 2 circumstances have come to my assistance. In the first place, the treatment did not last for more than 3 months, and in the second place, the material which elucidated the case was grouped around 2 dreams, one related in the middle of the treatment and one at the end. The wording of these dreams was recorded immediately after the session, and they thus afforded a secure point of attachment for the chain of interpretations and recollections which proceeded from them. The case history itself was only committed to writing from memory after the treatment was at an end, but while my recollection of the case was still fresh and was heightened by my interest in its publication. Thus the record is not absolutely, phonographically, exact, but it can claim to possess a high degree of trustworthiness. Nothing of any importance has been altered in it, except in some places the order in which the explanations are given, and this has been done for the sake of presenting the case in a more connected form. I next proceed to mention more particularly what is to be found in this paper and what is not to be found in it. The title of the work was originally Dreams and Hysteria, for it seemed to me peculiarly well adapted for showing how dream interpretation is woven into the history of a treatment, and how it can become the means of filling in amnesias and elucidating symptoms. It was not without good reasons that in the year 1900 I gave precedence to a laborious and exhaustive study of dreams, the interpretation of dreams, over the publications upon the psychology of the neuroses which I had in view. And incidentally, I was able to judge from its reception with what an inadequate degree of comprehension such efforts are met by other specialists at the present time. In this instance, there was no validity in the objection that the material upon which I had based my assertions had been withheld, and that it was therefore impossible to become convinced of their truth by testing and checking them. For everyone can submit his own dreams to analytic examination, and the technique of interpreting dreams may be easily learnt from the instructions and examples which I have given. I must once more insist, just as I did at that time, that a thorough investigation of the problems of dreams is an indispensable prerequisite for any comprehension of the mental processes in hysteria and the other psychoneuroses, and that no one who wishes to shirk that preparatory labor has the smallest prospect of advancing even a few steps into this region of knowledge. Since, therefore, this case history presupposes a knowledge of the interpretation of dreams, it will seem highly unsatisfactory to any reader to whom this presupposition does not apply. Such a reader will find only bewilderment in these pages, instead of the enlightenment he is in search of, and he will certainly be inclined to project the cause of his bewilderment onto the author and to pronounce his views fantastic. But in reality, this bewildering character attaches to the phenomena of the neurosis itself. Its presence there is only concealed by the physician's familiarity with the facts, and it comes to light again with every attempt at explaining them. It could only be completely banished if we could succeed in tracing back every single element of a neurosis to factors with which we were already familiar. But everything tends to show that, on the contrary, we shall be driven by the study of neuroses to assume the existence of many new things, which will later on gradually become the subject of more certain knowledge. What is new has always aroused bewilderment and resistance. In face of the incompleteness of my analytic results, I had no choice but to follow the example of those discoverers whose good fortune it is to bring to the light of day, after their long burial, the priceless, though mutilated, relics of antiquity. I have restored what is missing, taking the best models known to me from other analyses, but, like a conscientious archaeologist, I have not omitted to mention in each case where the authentic parts end and my constructions begin. There is another kind of incompleteness which I myself have intentionally introduced. I have, as a rule, not reproduced the process of interpretation to which the patient's associations and communications had to be subjected, but only the results of that process. Apart from the dreams, therefore, the technique of the analytic work has been revealed in only a very few places. For a third kind of incompleteness in this report, neither the patient nor the author is responsible. It is, on the contrary, obvious that a single case history, even if it were complete and open to no doubt, cannot provide an answer to all the questions arising out of the problem of hysteria. It cannot give an insight into all the types of this disorder, into all the forms of internal structure of the neurosis, into all the possible kinds of relation between the mental and the somatic which are to be found in hysteria. It is not fair to expect from a single case more than it can offer, and anyone who has hitherto been unwilling to believe that a psychosexual etiology holds good generally, and without exception, for hysteria, is scarcely likely to be convinced of the fact by taking stock of a single case history. He would do better to suspend his judgment until his own work has earned him the right to a conviction. 1. The clinical picture. In my interpretation of dreams, published in 1900, I showed that dreams in general can be interpreted, and that after the work of interpretation has been completed, they can be replaced by perfectly correctly constructed thoughts, which can be assigned a recognizable position in the chain of mental events. I wish to give an example in the following pages of the only practical application of which the art of interpreting dreams seems to admit. I have already mentioned, in the interpretation of dreams, how it was that I came upon the problem of dreams. The problem crossed my path as I was endeavoring to cure psychoneuroses by means of a particular psychotherapeutic method. For, among their other mental experiences, my patients told me their dreams, and these dreams seemed to call for insertion in the long thread of connections which spun itself out between a symptom of the disease and a pathogenic idea. At that time, I learned how to translate the language of dreams into the forms of expression of our own thought language, which can be understood without further help. And I may add that this knowledge is essential for the psychoanalyst, for the dream is one of the roads along which consciousness can be reached by the psychical material, which, on account of the opposition aroused by its content, has been cut off from consciousness and repressed, and has thus become pathogenic. The dream, in short, is one of the détours by which repression can be evaded. It is one of the principal means employed by what is known as the indirect method of representation in the mind. The following fragment from the history of the treatment of a hysterical girl is intended to show the way in which the interpretation of dreams plays a part in the work of analysis. It will, at the same time, give me a first opportunity of publishing at sufficient length to prevent further misunderstanding some of my views upon the psychical processes of hysteria and upon its organic determinants. I need no longer apologize on the score of length, since it is now agreed that the exacting demands which hysteria makes upon physician and investigator can be met only by the most sympathetic spirit of inquiry, and not by an attitude of superiority and contempt. It follows from the nature of the facts which form the material of psychoanalysis that we are obliged to pay as much attention in our case histories to the purely human and social circumstances of our patients as to the somatic data and the symptoms of the disorder. Above all, our interest will be directed towards their family circumstances, and not only, as will be seen later, for the purpose of inquiring into their heredity. The family circle of the 18-year-old girl, who is the subject of this paper, included, besides herself, her 2 parents and a brother who was 1.5 years her senior. Her father was the dominating figure in this circle, owing to his intelligence and his character as much as to the circumstances of his life. It was those circumstances which provided the framework for the history of the patient's childhood and illness. At the time at which I began the girl's treatment, her father was in his late 40s, a man of rather unusual activity and talents, a large manufacturer in very comfortable circumstances. His daughter was most tenderly attached to him, and for that reason her critical powers, which developed early, took all the more offense at many of his actions and peculiarities. Her affection for him was still further increased by the many severe illnesses which he had been through since her 6th year. At that time he had fallen ill with tuberculosis, and the family had consequently moved to a small town in a good climate, situated in one of our southern provinces. There his lung trouble rapidly improved, but on account of the precautions which were still considered necessary, both parents and children continued for the next 10 years or so to reside chiefly in this spot, which I shall call B. When her father's health was good, he used at times to be away on visits to his factories, During the hottest part of the summer, the family used to move to a health resort in the hills. When the girl was about 10 years old, her father had to go through a course of treatment in a darkened room on account of a detached retina. As a result of this misfortune, his vision was permanently impaired. His gravest illness occurred some 2 years later. It took the form of a confusional attack, followed by symptoms of paralysis and slight mental disturbances. A friend of his, who plays a part in the story with which we shall be concerned later on, persuaded him, while his condition had scarcely improved, to travel to Vienna with his physician and come to me for advice. I hesitated for some time as to whether I ought not to regard the case as one of taboo paralysis, but I finally decided upon a diagnosis of a diffuse vascular affection, and since the patient admitted having had a specific infection before his marriage, I prescribed an energetic course of anti-lutic treatment, as a result of which all the remaining disturbances passed off. It is no doubt owing to this fortunate intervention of mine that 4 years later he brought his daughter, who had meanwhile grown unmistakably neurotic, and introduced her to me, and that after another 2 years he handed her over to me for psychotherapeutic treatment. I had in the meantime also made the acquaintance in Vienna of a sister of his, who was a little older than himself. She gave clear evidence of a severe form of psychoneurosis without any characteristically hysterical symptoms. After a life which had been weighed down by an unhappy marriage, she died of a marasmus which made rapid advances, and the symptoms of which were, as a matter of fact, never fully cleared up. An elder brother of the girl's father, whom I once happened to meet, was a hypochondriacal bachelor. The sympathies of the girl herself, who, as I have said, became my patient at the age of 18, had always been with the father side of the family, and ever since she had fallen ill, she had taken as her model the aunt who has just been mentioned. There could be no doubt, too, that it was from her father's family that she had derived not only her natural gifts and her intellectual precocity, but also the predisposition to her illness. I never made her mother's acquaintance. From the accounts given me by the girl and her father, I was led to imagine her as an uncultivated woman, and above all as a foolish one, who had concentrated all her interests upon domestic affairs, especially since her husband's illness and the estrangement to which it led. She presented the picture, in fact, of what might be called the housewife psychosis. She had no understanding of her children's more active interests, and was occupied all day long in cleaning the house with its furniture and utensils, and in keeping them clean to such an extent as to make it almost impossible to use or enjoy them. This condition, traces of which are to be found, often enough, in normal housewives, inevitably reminds one of forms of obsessional washing and other kinds of obsessional cleanliness. But such women, and this applied to the patient's mother, are entirely without insight into their illness, so that one essential characteristic of an obsessional neurosis is lacking. The relations between the girl and her mother had been unfriendly for years. The daughter looked down on her mother and used to criticize her mercilessly, and she had withdrawn completely from her influence. During the girl's earlier years, her only brother, her elder by a year and a half, had been the model which her ambitions had striven to follow. But in the last few years, the relations between the brother and sister had grown more distant. The young man used to try so far as he could to keep out of the family disputes, but when he was obliged to take sides, he would support his mother, so that the usual sexual attraction had drawn together the father and daughter on the one side, and the mother and son on the other. The patient, to whom I shall in future give the name of Dora, had, even at the age of 8, begun to develop neurotic symptoms. She became subject at that time to chronic dyspnea, with occasional accesses in which the symptom was very much aggravated. The first onset occurred after a short expedition in the mountains, and was accordingly put down to overexertion. In the course of 6 months, during which she was made to rest and was carefully looked after, this condition gradually passed off. The family doctor seems to have had not a moment's hesitation in diagnosing the disorder as purely nervous, and in excluding any organic cause for the dyspnea. But he evidently considered this diagnosis compatible with the etiology of overexertion. The little girl went through the usual infectious diseases of childhood without suffering any lasting damage. As she herself told me, and her words were intended to convey a deeper meaning, her brother was, as a rule, the first to start the illness, and used to have it very slightly, and she would then follow suit with a severe form of it. When she was about 12, she began to suffer from unilateral headaches in the nature of a migraine, and from attacks of nervous coughing. At first, these two symptoms always appeared together, but they became separated later on and ran different courses. The migraine grew rarer, and by the time she was 16, she had quite got over it. But attacks of tussis nervosa, which had no doubt been started by a common catarrh, continued to occur over the whole period. When, at the age of 18, she came to me for treatment, she was again coughing in a characteristic manner. The number of these attacks could not be determined, but they lasted from 3 to 5 weeks, and on one occasion for several months. The most troublesome symptom during the first half of an attack of this kind, at all events in the last few years, used to be a complete loss of voice. The diagnosis that this was once more a nervous complaint had been established long since, but the various methods of treatment which are usual, including hydrotherapy and the local application of electricity, had produced no result. It was in such circumstances as these that the child had developed into a mature young woman of very independent judgment, who had grown accustomed to laugh at the efforts of doctors, and in the end to renounce their help entirely. Moreover, she had always been against calling in medical advice, though she had no personal objection to her family doctor. Every proposal to consult a new physician aroused her resistance, and it was only her father's authority which induced her to come to me at all. I first saw her when she was 16, in the early summer. She was suffering from a cough and from hoarseness, and even at that time I proposed giving her psychological treatment. My proposal was not adopted, since the attack in question, like the others, passed off spontaneously, though it had lasted unusually long. During the next winter she came and stayed in Vienna with her uncle and his daughters, after the death of the aunt of whom she had been so fond. There she fell ill of a feverish disorder which was diagnosed at the time as appendicitis. In the following autumn, since her father's health seemed to justify the step, the family left the health resort of B for good and all. They first moved to the town where her father's factory was situated, and then, scarcely a year later, settled in Vienna. Dora was by that time in the first bloom of youth, a girl of intelligent and engaging looks, but she was a source of heavy trials for her parents. Low spirits and an alteration in her character had now become the main features of her illness. She was clearly satisfied neither with herself nor with her family. Her attitude towards her father was unfriendly, and she was on very bad terms with her mother, who was bent upon drawing her into taking a share in the work of the house. She tried to avoid social intercourse, and employed herself, so far as she was allowed to, by the fatigue and lack of concentration of which she complained, with attending lectures for women, and with carrying on more or less serious studies. One day her parents were thrown into a state of great alarm by finding on the girl's writing desk, or inside it, a letter in which she took leave of them, because, as she said, she could no longer endure her life. Her father, indeed, being a man of some perspicacity, guessed that the girl had no serious suicidal intentions, but he was none the less very much shaken, and when one day, after a slight passage of words between him and his daughter, she had a first attack of loss of consciousness, an event which was subsequently covered by an amnesia, it was determined, in spite of her reluctance, that she should come to me for treatment. No doubt this case history, as I have so far outlined it, does not upon the whole seem worth recording. It is merely a case of petite hystérie, with the commonest of all somatic and mental symptoms, dyspnea, tussis nervosa, aphonia, and possibly migraines, together with depression, hysterical unsociability, and a tedium vitae which was probably not entirely genuine. More interesting cases of hysteria have no doubt been published, and they have very often been more carefully described, for nothing will be found in the following pages on the subject of stigmata of cutaneous sensibility, limitation of the visual field, or similar matters. I may venture to remark, however, that all such collections of the strange and wonderful phenomena of hysteria have but slightly advanced our knowledge of a disease which still remains as great a puzzle as ever. What is wanted is precisely an elucidation of the commonest cases, and of their most frequent and typical symptoms. I should have been very well satisfied if the circumstances had allowed me to give a complete elucidation of this case of petite hystérie, and my experiences with other patients leave me in no doubt that my analytic method would have enabled me to do so. In Dora's case, thanks to her father's shrewdness, which I have remarked upon more than once already, there was no need for me to look about for the points of contact between the circumstances of the patient's life and her illness, at all events in its most recent form. Her father told me that he and his family, while they were at B, had formed an intimate friendship with a married couple who had been settled there for several years. Frau K. had nursed him during his long illness, and had, in that way, he said, earned a title to his undying gratitude. Herr K. had always been most kind to Dora. He had gone on walks with her when he was there, and had made her small presents, but no one had thought any harm of that. Dora had taken the greatest care of K's two little children, and been almost a mother to them. When Dora and her father had come to see me 2 years before, in the summer, they had been just on their way to stop with Herr and Frau K., who were spending the summer on one of our lakes in the Alps. Dora was to have spent several weeks at the K's, while her father had intended to return home after a few days. During that time, Herr K. had been staying there as well. As her father was preparing for his departure, the girl had suddenly declared with the greatest determination that she was going with him, and she had in fact put her decision into effect. It was not until some days later that she had thrown any light upon her strange behavior. She had then told her mother, intending that what she said should be passed on to her father, that Herr K. had had the audacity to make her a proposal while they were on a walk after a trip upon the lake. Herr K. had been called to account by her father and uncle on the next occasion of their meeting, but he had denied in the most emphatic terms having on his side made any advances which could have been open to such a construction. He had then proceeded to throw suspicion upon the girl, saying that he had heard from Frau K. that she took no interest in anything but sexual matters, and that she used to read Mantegazza's Physiology of Love and books of that sort in their house on the lake. It was most likely, he had added, that she had been overexcited by such reading and had merely fancied the whole scene she had described. I have no doubt, continued her father, that this incident is responsible for Dora's depression and irritability and suicidal ideas. She keeps pressing me to break off relations with Herr K., and more particularly with Frau K., whom she used positively to worship formally. But that I cannot do. For, to begin with, I myself believe that Dora's tale of the man's immoral suggestions is a fantasy that has forced its way into her mind. And besides, I am bound to Frau K. by ties of honourable friendship, and I do not wish to cause her pain. The poor woman is most unhappy with her husband, of whom, by the by, I have no very high opinion. She herself has suffered a great deal with her nerves, and I am her only support. With my state of health, I need scarcely assure you that there is nothing wrong in our relations. We are just two poor wretches who give one another what comfort we can by an exchange of friendly sympathy. You know already that I get nothing out of my own wife. But Dora, who inherits my obstinacy, cannot be moved from her hatred of the K's. She had her last attack, after a conversation in which she had again pressed me to break with them. Please try and bring her to reason. Her father's words did not always quite tally with this pronouncement, for on other occasions he tried to put the chief blame for Dora's impossible behavior on her mother, whose peculiarities made the house unbearable for everyone. But I had resolved from the first to suspend my judgment of the true state of affairs till I had heard the other side as well. The experience with Herr K., his making love to her, and the insult to her honour which was involved, seems to provide, in Dora's case, the psychical trauma, which Breuer and I declared long ago to be the indispensable prerequisite for the production of a hysterical disorder. But this new case also presents all the difficulties which have since led me to go beyond that theory, besides an additional difficulty of a special kind. For as so often happens in histories of cases of hysteria, the trauma that we know of as having occurred in the patient's past life is insufficient to explain or to determine the particular character of the symptoms. We should understand just as much or just as little of the whole business if the result of the trauma had been symptoms quite other than tussis nervosa, aphonia, depression, and tedium vitae. But there is the further consideration that some of these symptoms, the cough and the loss of voice, had been produced by the patient years before the time of the trauma, and that their earliest appearances belonged to her childhood, since they occurred in her 8th year. If, therefore, the trauma theory is not to be abandoned, we must go back to her childhood and look about there for any influences or impressions which might have had an effect analogous to that of trauma. Moreover, it deserves to be remarked that in the investigation, even of cases in which the first symptoms had not already set in childhood, I have been driven to trace back the patient's life history to the earliest years. When the first difficulties of the treatment had been overcome, Dora told me of an earlier episode with Herr K., which was even better calculated to act as a sexual trauma. She was 14 years old at the time. Herr K. had made an arrangement with her and his wife that they should meet him one afternoon at his place of business in the principal square of B, so as to have a view of a church festival. He persuaded his wife, however, to stay at home and sent away his clerks, so that he was alone when the girl arrived. When the time for the procession approached, he asked the girl to wait for him at the door which opened onto the staircase leading to the upper story, while he pulled down the outside shutters. He then came back, and instead of going out by the open door, suddenly clasped the girl to him and pressed a kiss upon her lips. This was surely just the situation to call up a distinct feeling of sexual excitement in a girl of 14 who had never before been approached. But Dora had at that moment a violent feeling of disgust, tore herself free from the man, and hurried past him to the staircase, and from there to the street door. She nevertheless continued to meet Herr K. Neither of them ever mentioned the little scene, and according to her account, Dora kept it a secret till her confession during the treatment. For some time afterwards, however, she avoided being alone with Herr K. The K's had just made plans for an expedition which was to last for some days, and on which Dora was to have accompanied them. After the scene of the kiss, she refused to join the party, without giving any reason. In this scene, second in order of mention, but first in order of time, the behavior of this child of 14 was already entirely and completely hysterical. I should without question consider a person hysterical in whom an occasion for sexual excitement elicited feelings that were preponderantly or exclusively unpleasurable, and I should do so whether or no the person were capable of producing somatic symptoms. The elucidation of the mechanism of this reversal of affect is one of the most important and, at the same time, one of the most difficult problems in the psychology of the neuroses. In my own judgment, I am still some way from having achieved this end, and I may add that within the limits of the present paper, I shall be able to bring forward only a part of such knowledge on the subject as I do possess. In order to particularize Dora's case, it is not enough merely to draw attention to the reversal of affect. There has also been a displacement of sensation. Instead of the genital sensation, which would certainly have been felt by a healthy girl in such circumstances, Dora was overcome by the unpleasurable feeling which is proper to the tract of mucous membrane at the entrance to the alimentary canal. That is, by disgust. The stimulation of her lips by the kiss was no doubt of importance in localizing the feeling of that particular place, but I think I can also recognize another factor in operation. The disgust which Dora felt on that occasion did not become a permanent symptom, and even at the time of the treatment it was only, as it were, potentially present. She was a poor eater, and confessed to some disinclination for food. On the other hand, the scene had left another consequence behind it in the shape of a sensory hallucination, which occurred from time to time, and even made its appearance while she was telling me her story. She declared that she could still feel upon the upper part of her body the pressure of Herr K.'s embrace. In accordance with certain rules of symptom formation, which I have come to know, and at the same time taking into account certain other of the patient's peculiarities, which were otherwise inexplicable, such as her unwillingness to walk past any man whom she saw engaged in eager or affectionate conversation with a lady, I have formed in my own mind the following reconstruction of the scene. I believe that during the man's passionate embrace, she felt not merely his kiss upon her lips, but also the pressure of his erect member against her body. This perception was revolting to her. It was dismissed from her memory, repressed, and replaced by the innocent sensation of pressure upon her thorax, which in turn derived an excessive intensity from its repressed source. Once more, therefore, we find a displacement from the lower part of the body to the upper. On the other hand, the compulsive piece of behavior which I have mentioned was formed as though it were derived from the undistorted recollection of the scene. She did not like walking past any man whom she thought was in a state of sexual excitement, because she wanted to avoid seeing for a second time the somatic sign which accompanies it. It is worth remarking that we have here three symptoms: the disgust, the sensation of pressure on the upper part of the body, and the avoidance of men engaged in affectionate conversation, all of them derive from a single experience, and that it is only by taking into account the interrelation of these three phenomena that we can understand the way in which the formation of the symptoms came about. The disgust is the symptom of repression in the erotogenic oral zone, which, as we shall hear, had been overindulged in Dora's infancy by the habit of sensual sucking. The pressure of the erect member probably led to an analogous change in the corresponding female organ, the clitoris, and the excitation of this second erotogenic zone was referred by a process of displacement to the simultaneous pressure against the thorax and became fixed there. Her avoidance of men who might possibly be in a state of sexual excitement follows the mechanism of a phobia, its purpose being to safeguard her against any revival of the repressed perception. In order to show that such a supplement to the story was possible, I questioned the patient very cautiously as to whether she knew anything of the physical signs of excitement in a man's body. Her answer, as touching the present, was yes, but as touching the time of the episode, I think not. From the very beginning, I took the greatest pains with this patient not to introduce her to any fresh facts in the region of sexual knowledge, and I did this not from any conscientious motives, but because I was anxious to subject my assumptions to a rigorous test in this case. Accordingly, I did not call a thing by its name until her allusions to it had become so unambiguous that there seemed very slight risk in translating them into direct speech. Her answer was always prompt and frank. She knew about it already. But the question of where her knowledge came from was a riddle which her memories were unable to solve. She had forgotten the source of all her information on this subject. If I may suppose that the scene of the kiss took place in this way, I can arrive at the following derivation for the feelings of disgust. Such feelings seem originally to be a reaction to the smell, and afterwards also to the sight of excrement. But the genitals can act as a reminder of the excretory functions, and this applies especially to the male member, for that organ performs the function of micturition as well as the sexual function. Indeed, the function of micturition is the earlier known of the two, and the only one known during the presexual period. Thus it happens that disgust becomes one of the means of effective expression in the sphere of sexual life. The early Christian fathers, inter urinas et feces nascimur, clings to sexual life and cannot be detached from it in spite of every effort at idealization. I should like, however, expressly to emphasize my opinion that the problem is not solved by the mere pointing out of this path of association. The fact that this association can be called up does not show that it actually will be called up, and indeed in normal circumstances it will not be. A knowledge of the paths does not render less necessary a knowledge of the forces which travel along them. I did not find it easy, however, to direct the patient's attention to her relations with Herr K. She declared that she had done with him, the uppermost layer of all her associations during the sessions, and everything of which she was easily conscious, and of which she remembered having been conscious the day before, was always connected with her father. It was quite true that she could not forgive her father for continuing his relations with Herr K., and more particularly with Frau K., but she viewed those relations in a very different light from that in which her father wished them to appear. In her mind there was no doubt that what bound her father to this young and beautiful woman was a common love affair. Nothing that could help to confirm this view had escaped her perception, which in this connection was pitilessly sharp. Here there were no gaps to be found in her memory. Their acquaintance with the K's had begun before her father's serious illness, but it had not become intimate until the young woman had officially taken on the position of nurse during that illness, while Dora's mother had kept away from the sick room. During the first summer holidays after his recovery, things had happened which must have opened everyone's eyes to the true character of this friendship. The two families had taken a suite of rooms in common at the hotel. One day Frau K. had announced that she could not keep the bedrooms which she had up till then shared with one of her children. A few days later, Dora's father had given up his bedroom, and they had both moved into new rooms, the end rooms, which were only separated by the passage, while the rooms they had given up had not offered any such security against interruption. Later on, whenever she had reproached her father about Frau K., He had been in the habit of saying that he could not understand her hostility, and that, on the contrary, his children had every reason for being grateful to Frau K. Her mother, whom she had asked for an explanation of this mysterious remark, had told her that her father had been so unhappy at that time that he had made up his mind to go into the wood and kill himself, and that Frau K., suspecting as much, had gone after him, and had persuaded him by her entreaties to preserve his life for the sake of his family. Of course, Dora went on, she herself did not believe this story. No doubt the two of them had been seen together in the wood, and her father had thereupon invented this fairy tale of his suicide so as to account for their rendezvous. When they had returned to B, her father had visited Frau K. every day at definite hours, while her husband was at his business. Everybody had talked about it and had questioned her about it pointedly. Herr K. himself had often complained bitterly to her mother, though he had spared her herself any allusions to the subject, which she seemed to attribute to delicacy of feeling on his part. When they had all gone for walks together, her father and Frau K. had always known how to manage things so as to be alone with each other. There could be no doubt that she had taken money from him, for she spent more than she could possibly have afforded out of her own purse or her husband's. Dora added that her father had begun to make handsome presents to Frau K., and in order to make these less conspicuous, had at the same time become especially liberal towards her mother and herself. And while previously Frau K. had been an invalid, and had even been obliged to spend months in a sanatorium for nervous disorders because she had been unable to walk, she had now become a healthy and lively woman. Even after they had left B for the manufacturing town, these relations, already of many years' standing, had been continued. From time to time her father used to declare that he could not endure the rawness of the climate, and that he must do something for himself. He would begin to cough and complain, until suddenly he would start off to B, and from there write the most cheerful letters home. All these illnesses had only been pretexts for seeing his friend again. Then one day it had been decided that they were to move to Vienna, and Dora began to suspect a hidden connection. And sure enough, they had scarcely been 3 weeks in Vienna when she heard that the K's had moved there as well. They were in Vienna, so she told me, at that very moment, and she frequently met her father with Frau K. in the street. She also met Herr K. very often, and he always used to turn round and look after her, and once, when he had met her out by herself, he had followed her for a long way, so as to make sure where she was going, and whether she might not have a rendezvous. On one occasion during the course of the treatment, her father again felt worse, and went off to B for several weeks. And the sharp-sighted Dora had soon unearthed the fact that Frau K. had started off to the same place on a visit to her relatives there. It was at this time that Dora's criticisms of her father were the most frequent. He was insincere, he had a strain of falseness in his character, he only thought of his own enjoyment, and he had a gift for seeing things in the light which suited him best. I could not in general dispute Dora's characterization of her father, and there was one particular respect in which it was easy to see that her reproaches were justified. When she was feeling embittered, she used to be overcome by the idea that she had been handed over to Herr K. as the price of his tolerating the relations between her father and his wife, and her rage at her father's making such a use of her was visible behind her affection for him. At other times she was quite well aware that she had been guilty of exaggeration in talking like this. The two men had, of course, never made a formal agreement in which she was treated as an object for barter. Her father in particular would have been horrified at any such suggestion. But he was one of those men who know how to evade a dilemma by falsifying their judgment upon one of the conflicting alternatives. If it had been pointed out to him that there might be a danger for a growing girl in the constant and unsupervised companionship of a man who had no satisfaction from his own wife, he would have been certain to answer that he could rely upon his daughter, that a man like K could never be dangerous to her, and that his friend was himself incapable of such intentions, or that Dora was still a child and was treated as a child by K. But as a matter of fact, things were in a position in which each of the two men avoided drawing any conclusions from the other's behavior, which would have been awkward for his own plans. It was possible for Herr K to send Dora flowers every day for a whole year while he was in the neighborhood, to take every opportunity of giving her valuable presents, and to spend all his spare time in her company without her parents noticing anything in his behavior that was characteristic of lovemaking. When a patient brings forward a sound and incontestable train of argument during psychoanalytic treatment, the physician is liable to feel a moment's embarrassment, and the patient may take advantage of it by asking, "This is all perfectly correct and true, isn't it? What do you want to change in now that I've told it you?" But it soon becomes evident that the patient is using thoughts of this kind, which the analysis cannot attack, for the purpose of cloaking others which are anxious to escape from criticism and from consciousness. A string of reproaches against other people leads one to suspect the existence of a string of self-reproaches with the same content. All that need be done is to turn back each particular reproach on to the speaker himself. There is something undeniably automatic about this method of defending oneself against a self-reproach by making the same reproach against someone else. A model of it is to be found in the tu quoque arguments of children. If one of them is accused of being a liar, he will reply without an instant's hesitation, "You're another." A grown-up person who wanted to throw back abuse would look for some really exposed spot in his antagonist, and would not lay the chief stress upon the same content being repeated. In paranoia, the projection of a reproach onto another person, without any alteration in its content, and therefore without any consideration for reality, becomes manifest as the process of forming delusions. Dora's reproaches against her father had a lining or backing of self-reproaches of this kind, with a corresponding content in every case, as I shall show in detail. She was right in thinking that her father did not wish to look too closely into Herr K's behavior to his daughter, for fear of being disturbed in his own love affair with Frau K. But Dora herself had done precisely the same thing. She had made herself an accomplice in the affair, and had dismissed from her mind every sign which tended to show its true character. It was not until after her adventure by the lake that her eyes were opened, and that she began to apply such a severe standard to her father. During all the previous years, she had given every possible assistance to her father's relations with Frau K. She would never go to see her if she thought her father was there, but knowing that in that case the children would have been sent out, she would turn her steps in a direction where she would be sure to meet them, and would go for a walk with them. There had been someone in the house who had been anxious at an early stage to open her eyes to the nature of her father's relations with Frau K., and to induce her to take sides against her. This was her last governess, an unmarried woman, no longer young, who was well-read and of advanced views. The teacher and her pupil were for a while upon excellent terms, until suddenly Dora became hostile to her and insisted on her dismissal. So long as the governess had any influence, she used it for stirring up feeling against Frau K. She explained to Dora's mother that it was incompatible with her dignity to tolerate such an intimacy between her husband and another woman, and she drew Dora's attention to all the obvious features of their relations. But her efforts were in vain. Dora remained devoted to Frau K., and would hear of nothing that might make her think ill of her relations with her father. On the other hand, she very easily fathomed the motives by which her governess was actuated. She might be blind in one direction, but she was sharp-sighted enough in the other. She saw that the governess was in love with her father. When he was there, she seemed to be quite another person. At such times, she could be amusing and obliging. While the family were living in the manufacturing town, and Frau K. was not on the horizon, her hostility was directed against Dora's mother, who was then her most immediate rival. Up to this point, Dora bore her no ill will. She did not become angry until she observed that she herself was a subject of complete indifference to the governess, whose pretended affection for her was really meant for her father. While her father was away from the manufacturing town, the governess had no time to spare for her, would not go for walks with her, and took no interest in her studies. No sooner had her father returned from B than she was once more ready with every sort of service and assistance. Thereupon, Dora dropped her. The poor woman had thrown a most unwelcome light on a part of Dora's own behavior. What the governess had from time to time been to Dora, Dora had been to Herr K.'s children. She had been a mother to them. She had taught them. She had gone for walks with them. She had offered them a complete substitute for the slight interest which their own mother showed in them. Herr K. and his wife had often talked of getting a divorce, but it never took place, because Herr K., who was an affectionate father, would not give up either of the two children. A common interest in the children had, from the first, been a bond between Herr K. and Dora. Her preoccupation with his children was evidently a cloak for something else that Dora was anxious to hide from herself and from other people. The same inference was to be drawn both from her behavior towards the children, regarded in the light of the governess's behavior towards herself, and from her silent acquiescence in her father's relations with Frau K., namely, that she had all these years been in love with Herr K. When I informed her of this conclusion, she did not assent to it. It is true that she at once told me that other people besides, one of her cousins, for instance, a girl who had stopped with them for some time at B, had said to her, "Why, you're simply wild about that man." But she herself could not be got to recollect any feelings of the kind. Later on, when the quantity of material that had come up had made it difficult for her to persist in her denial, she admitted that she might have been in love with Herr K. at B, but declared that since the scene by the lake, it had all been over. In any case, it was quite certain that the reproaches which she made against her father of having been deaf to the most imperative calls of duty, and of having seen things in the light which was most convenient from the point of view of his own passions, these reproaches recoiled on her own head. Note: the question then arises, if Dora loved Herr K., what was the reason for her refusing him in the scene by the lake? Or at any rate, why did her refusal take such a brutal form, as though she were embittered against him? And how could a girl who was in love feel insulted by a proposal which was made in a manner neither tactless nor offensive? End note. Her other reproach against her father was that his ill health was only a pretext, and that he exploited it for his own purposes. This reproach, too, concealed a whole section of her own secret history. One day she complained of a professedly new symptom, which consisted of piercing gastric pains. "Whom are you copying now?" I asked her, and found I had hit the mark. The day before, she had visited her cousins, the daughters of the aunt who had died. The younger one had become engaged, and this had given occasion to the elder one for falling ill with gastric pains, and she was to be sent off to Semmering. Dora thought it was all just envy on the part of the elder sister. She always got ill when she wanted something, and what she wanted now was to be away from home, so as not to have to look on at her sister's happiness. But Dora's own gastric pains proclaimed the fact that she identified herself with this cousin, who, according to her, was a malingerer. Her grounds for this identification were either that she, too, envied the luckier girl her love, or that she saw her own story reflected in that of the elder sister, who had recently had a love affair which had ended unhappily. But she had also learned from observing Frau K. what useful things illnesses could become. Herr K. spent part of the year in traveling. Whenever he came back, he used to find his wife in bad health, although, as Dora knew, she had been quite well only the day before. Dora realized that the presence of the husband had the effect of making his wife ill, and that she was glad to be ill so as to be able to escape the conjugal duties which she so much detested. At this point in the discussion, Dora suddenly brought in an allusion to her own alternations between good and bad health during the first years of her girlhood at B, and I was thus driven to suspect that her states of health were to be regarded as depending upon something else, in the same way as Frau K.'s. It is a rule of psychoanalytic technique that an internal connection, which is still undisclosed, will announce its presence by means of a contiguity, a temporal proximity of associations. Just as in writing, if A and B are put side by side, it means that the syllable ab is to be formed out of them. Dora had had a very large number of attacks of coughing, accompanied by loss of voice. Could it be that the presence or absence of the man she loved had had an influence upon the appearance and disappearance of the symptoms of her illness? If this were so, it must be possible to discover some coincidence or other which would betray the fact. I asked her what the average length of these attacks had been. From 3 to 6 weeks, perhaps. How long had Herr K.'s absences lasted? 3 to 6 weeks, too, she was obliged to admit. Her illness was therefore a demonstration of her love for K., just as his wife's was a demonstration of her dislike. It was only necessary to suppose that her behavior had been the opposite of Frauke's, and that she had been ill when he was absent and well when he had come back. And this really seemed to have been so, at least during the period of the attacks. Later on, it no doubt became necessary to obscure the coincidence between her attacks of illness and the absence of the man she secretly loved, lest its regularity should betray her secret. The length of the attacks would then remain as a trace of their original significance. I remembered that long before, while I was working at Charcot's clinic, I had seen and heard how in cases of hysterical mutism, writing operated vicariously in the place of speech. Such patients were able to write more fluently, quicker, and better than others did, or than they themselves had done previously. The same thing had happened with Dora. In the first days of her attacks of aphonia, writing had always come specially easy to her. No psychological elucidation was really required for this peculiarity, which was the expression of a physiological substitutive function enforced by necessity. It was noticeable, however, that such an elucidation was easily to be found. Herr K. used to write to her at length while he was travelling, and to send her picture postcards. It used to happen that she alone was informed as to the date of his return, and that his arrival took his wife by surprise. Moreover, that a person will correspond with an absent friend whom he cannot talk to is scarcely less obvious than that if he had lost his voice, he will try to make himself understood in writing. Dora's aphonia, then, allowed of the following symbolic interpretation. When the man she loved was away, she gave up speaking. Speech had lost its value since she could not speak to him. On the other hand, writing gained in importance, as being the only means of communication with him in his absence. Am I now going on to assert that in every instance in which there are periodical attacks of aphonia, we are to diagnose the existence of a loved person who is at times away from the patient? Nothing could be further from my intention. The determination of Dora's symptoms is far too specific for it to be possible to expect a frequent recurrence of the same accidental etiology. But if so, what is the value of our elucidation of the aphonia in the present case? Have we not merely allowed ourselves to become the victims of a jeu d'esprit? I think not. In this connection, we must recall the question, which has so often been raised, whether the symptoms of hysteria are of psychical or of somatic origin, or whether, if the former is granted, they are necessarily all of them psychically determined. Like so many other questions to which we find investigators returning again and again without success, this question is not adequately framed. The alternatives stated in it do not cover the real essence of the matter. As far as I can see, every hysterical symptom involves the participation of both sides. It cannot occur without the presence of a certain degree of somatic compliance offered by some normal or pathological process in or connected with one of the bodily organs. And it cannot occur more than once, and the capacity for repeating itself is one of the characteristics of a hysterical symptom, unless it has a psychical significance, a meaning. The hysterical symptom does not carry this meaning with it, but the meaning is lent to it, soldered to it as it were, and in every instance the meaning can be a different one, according to the nature of the suppressed thoughts which are struggling for expression. However, there are a number of factors at work which tend to make less arbitrary the relations between the unconscious thoughts and the somatic processes that are at their disposal as a means of expression, and which tend to make those relations approximate to a few typical forms. For therapeutic purposes, the most important determinants are those given by the fortuitous psychical material. The clearing up of the symptoms is achieved by looking for their psychical significance. When everything that can be got rid of by psychoanalysis has been cleared away, we are in a position to form all kinds of conjectures which probably meet the facts, as regards the somatic basis of the symptoms, a basis which is, as a rule, constitutional and organic. Thus, in Dora's case, we shall not content ourselves with a psychoanalytic interpretation of her attacks of coughing and aphonia, but we shall also indicate the organic factor which was the source of the somatic compliance that enabled her to express her love for a man who was periodically absent. And if the connection between the symptomatic expression and the unconscious mental content should strike us as being, in this case, a clever tour de force, we shall be relieved to hear that it succeeds in creating the same impression in every other case and in every other instance. I am prepared to be told at this point that there is no very great advantage in having been taught by psychoanalysis that the clue to the problem of hysteria is to be found not in a peculiar instability of the molecules of the nerves, or in a liability to hypnoid states, but in a somatic compliance. But in reply to the objection, I may remark that this new view has not only to some extent pushed the problem further back, but has also to some extent diminished it. We have no longer to deal with the whole problem, but only with the portion of it involving that particular characteristic of hysteria which differentiates it from other psychoneuroses. The mental events in all psychoneuroses proceed for a considerable distance along the same lines before any question arises of the somatic compliance, which may afford the unconscious mental processes a physical outlet. When this factor is not forthcoming, something other than a hysterical symptom will arise out of the total situation. Yet it will be something of an allied nature, a phobia perhaps, or an obsession, in short, a psychical symptom. I now return to the reproach of malingering which Dora brought against her father. It soon became evident that this reproach corresponded to self-reproaches not only concerning her earlier states of ill health, but also concerning the present time. At such points, the physician is usually faced by the task of guessing and filling in what the analysis offers him in the shape only of hints and allusions. I was obliged to point out to the patient that her present ill health was just as much actuated by motives and was just as tendentious as had been Frau K's illness, which she had understood so well. There could be no doubt, I said, that she had an aim in view which she hoped to gain by her illness. That aim could be none other than to detach her father from Frau K. She had been unable to achieve this by prayers or arguments. Perhaps she hoped to succeed by frightening her father. There was her farewell letter, or by awakening his pity. There were her fainting fits. Or, if all this was in vain, at least she would be taking her revenge on him. She knew very well, I went on, how much he was attached to her, and that tears used to come into his eyes whenever he was asked after his daughter's health. I felt quite convinced that she would recover at once if only her father were to tell her that he had sacrificed Frau K for the sake of her health. But, I added, I hoped he would not let himself be persuaded to do this, for then she would have learned what a powerful weapon she had in her hands, and she would certainly not fail on every future occasion to make use once more of her liability to ill health. Yet if her father refused to give way to her, I was quite sure she would not let herself be deprived of her illness so easily. Motives that support the patient in being ill are probably to be found in all fully developed cases, but there are some in which the motives are purely internal, such as desire for self-punishment, that is, penitence and remorse. It will be found much easier to solve the therapeutic problem in such cases than in those in which the illness is related to the attainment of some external aim. In Dora's case, that aim was clearly to touch her father's heart and to detach him from Frau K. None of her father's actions seemed to have embittered her so much as his readiness to consider the scene by the lake as a product of her imagination. She was almost beside herself at the idea of its being supposed that she had merely fancied something on that occasion. For a long time I was in perplexity as to what the self-reproach could be which lay behind her passionate repudiation of this explanation of the episode. It was justifiable to suspect that there was something concealed, for a reproach which misses the mark gives no lasting offense. On the other hand, I came to the conclusion that Dora's story must correspond to the facts in every respect. No sooner had she grasped Herr K's intention than, without letting him finish what he had to say, she had given him a slap in the face and hurried away. Her behavior must have seemed as incomprehensible to the man after she had left him as to us, for he must long before have gathered from innumerable small signs that he was secure of the girl's affections. In our discussion of Dora's second dream, we shall come upon the solution of this riddle, as well as upon the self-reproach which we have hitherto failed to discover. As she kept on repeating her complaints against her father with a wearisome monotony, and as at the time her cough continued, I was led to think that this symptom might have some meaning in connection with her father. And apart from this, the explanation of the symptom, which I had hitherto obtained, was far from fulfilling the requirements which I am accustomed to make of such explanations. According to a rule which I had found confirmed over and over again by experience, though I had not yet ventured to erect it into a general principle, a symptom signifies the representation, the realization, of a fantasy with a sexual content. That is to say, it signifies a sexual situation. It would be better to say that at least one of the meanings of a symptom is the representation of a sexual fantasy, but that no such limitation is imposed upon the content of its other meanings. Anyone who takes up psychoanalytic work will quickly discover that a symptom has more than one meaning, and serves to represent several unconscious mental processes simultaneously. And I should like to add that in my estimation, a single unconscious mental process or fantasy will scarcely ever suffice for the production of a symptom. An opportunity very soon occurred for interpreting Dora's nervous cough in this way, by means of an imagined sexual situation. She had once again been insisting that Frau K. only loved her father because he was ein vermögender Mann, a man of means. Certain details of the way in which she expressed herself, which I pass over here, like most other purely technical parts of the analysis, led me to see that behind this phrase its opposite lay concealed, namely that her father was ein unvermögender Mann, a man without means. This could only be meant in a sexual sense, that her father, as a man, was without means, was impotent. Dora confirmed this interpretation from her conscious knowledge, whereupon I pointed out the contradiction she was involved in, if on the one hand she continued to insist that her father's relation with Frau K. was a common love affair, and on the other hand maintained that her father was impotent, or in other words, incapable of carrying on an affair of such a kind. Her answer showed that she had no need to admit the contradiction. She knew very well, she said, that there was more than one way of obtaining sexual gratification. The source of this piece of knowledge, however, was once more untraceable. I questioned her further, whether she referred to the use of organs other than the genitals for the purpose of sexual intercourse, and she replied in the affirmative. I could then go on to say that in that case she must be thinking of precisely those parts of the body which in her case were in a state of irritation, the throat and the oral cavity. To be sure, she would not hear of going so far as this in recognizing her own thoughts. And indeed, if the occurrence of the symptom was to be made possible at all, it was essential that she should not be completely clear on the subject. But the conclusion was inevitable that with her spasmodic cough, which, as is usual, was referred for its exciting stimulus to a tickling in her throat, she pictured to herself a scene of sexual gratification per os, between the two people whose love affair occupied her mind so incessantly. A very short time after she had tacitly accepted this explanation, her cough vanished, which fitted in very well with my view. But I do not wish to lay too much stress upon this development, since her cough had so often before disappeared spontaneously. This short piece of the analysis may perhaps have excited in the medical reader, apart from the skepticism to which he is entitled, feelings of astonishment and horror. And I am prepared at this point to look into these two reactions so as to discover whether they are justifiable. The astonishment is probably caused by my daring to talk about such delicate and unpleasant subjects to a young girl, or for that matter to any woman who is sexually active. The horror is aroused, no doubt, by the possibility that an inexperienced girl could know about practices of such a kind and could occupy her imagination with them. I would advise recourse to moderation and reasonableness upon both points. There is no cause for indignation either in the one case or in the other. It is possible for a man to talk to girls and women upon sexual matters of every kind without doing them harm and without bringing suspicion upon himself, so long as, in the first place, he adopts a particular way of doing it, and in the second place, can make them feel convinced that it is unavoidable. A gynecologist, after all, under the same conditions, does not hesitate to make them submit to uncovering every possible part of their body. The best way of speaking about such things is to be dry and direct, and that is, at the same time, the method furthest removed from the prurience with which the same subjects are handled in society, and to which girls and women alike are so thoroughly accustomed. I call bodily organs and processes by their technical names, and I tell these to the patient if they, the names I mean, happen to be unknown to her. J'appelle un chat un chat. I have certainly heard of some people, doctors and laymen, who are scandalized by a therapeutic method in which conversations of this sort occur, and who appear to envy either me or my patients the titillation which, according to their notions, such a method must afford. But I am too well acquainted with the respectability of these gentry to excite myself over them. I shall avoid the temptation of writing a satire upon them, but there is one thing I will mention. Often, after I have for some time treated a patient who had not at first found it easy to be open about sexual matters, I have had the satisfaction of hearing her exclaim, "Why, after all, your treatment is far more respectable than Mr. X's conversation." No one can undertake the treatment of a case of hysteria until he is convinced of the impossibility of avoiding the mention of sexual subjects, or unless he is prepared to allow himself to be convinced by experience. The right attitude is, "Pour faire une omelette, il faut casser des œufs." The patients themselves are easy to convince, and there are only too many opportunities of doing so in the course of the treatment. There is no necessity for feeling any compunction at discussing the facts of normal or abnormal sexual life with them. With the exercise of a little caution, all that is done is to translate into conscious ideas what was already known in the unconscious. And, after all, the whole effectiveness of the treatment is based upon our knowledge that the affect attached to an unconscious idea operates more strongly, and, since it cannot be inhibited, more injuriously than the affect attached to a conscious one. There is never any danger of corrupting an inexperienced girl. For where there is no knowledge of sexual processes, even in the unconscious, no hysterical symptom will arise, and where hysteria is found, there can no longer be any question of innocence of mind in the sense in which parents and educators use this phrase. With children of 10, of 12, or of 14, with boys and girls alike, I have satisfied myself that the truth of this statement can invariably be relied upon. As regards the second kind of emotional reaction, which is not directed against me this time, but against my patient, supposing that my view of her is correct, and which regards the perverse nature of her fantasies as horrible, I should like to say emphatically that a medical man has no business to indulge in such passionate condemnation. I may also remark in passing that it seems to me superfluous for a physician, who is writing upon the aberrations of the sexual instincts, to seize every opportunity of inserting into the test expressions of his personal repugnance at such revolting things. We are faced by a fact, and it is to be hoped that we shall grow accustomed to it when we have put our own tastes on one side. We must learn to speak with indignation of what we call the sexual perversions, instances in which the sexual function has extended its limits in respect either to the part of the body concerned or to the sexual object chosen. The uncertainty in regard to the boundaries of what is to be called normal sexual life, when we take different races and different epochs into account, should in itself be enough to cool the zealot's ardor. We surely ought not to forget that the perversion which is the most repellent to us, the sensual love of a man for a man, was not only tolerated by a people so far our superiors in cultivation as were the Greeks, but was actually entrusted by them with important social functions. The sexual life of each one of us extends to a slight degree, now in this direction, now in that, beyond the narrow lines imposed as the standard of normality. The perversions are neither bestial nor degenerate in the emotional sense of the word. They are a development of germs, all of which are contained in the undifferentiated sexual disposition of the child, and which, by being suppressed or by being diverted to higher asexual aims, by being sublimated, are destined to provide the energy for a great number of our cultural achievements. When, therefore, anyone has become a gross and manifest pervert, it would be more correct to say that he has remained one, for he exhibits a certain stage of inhibited development. All psychoneurotics are persons with strongly marked perverse tendencies, which have been repressed in the course of their development and have become unconscious. Consequently, their unconscious fantasies show precisely the same content as the documentarily recorded actions of perverts, even though they have not read Krafft-Ebing's Psychopatha sexualis, to which simple-minded people attribute such a large share of the responsibility for the production of perverse tendencies. Psychoneuroses are, so to speak, the negative of perversions. In neurotics, their sexual constitution, under which the effects of heredity are included, operates in combination with any accidental influences in their life which may disturb the development of normal sexuality. A stream of water which meets with an obstacle in the riverbed is dammed up and flows back into old channels which had formerly seemed fated to run dry. The motive forces leading to the formation of hysterical symptoms draw their strength not only from the repressed normal sexuality, but also from unconscious perverse activities. The less repellent of the so-called sexual perversions are very widely diffused among the whole population, as everyone knows except medical writers upon the subject. Or I should rather say, they know it too, only they take care to forget it at the moment when they take up their pens to write about it. So it is not to be wondered at that this hysterical girl of nearly 19, who had heard of the occurrence of such a method of sexual intercourse, sucking at the male organ, should have developed an unconscious fantasy of this sort, and should have given it expression by an irritation in her throat and by coughing. Nor would it have been very extraordinary if she had arrived at such a fantasy even without having had any enlightenment from external sources, an occurrence which I have quite certainly observed in other patients. For in her case, a noteworthy fact afforded the necessary somatic prerequisite for this independent creation of a fantasy, which would coincide with the practices of perverts. She remembered very well that in her childhood she had been a thumb-sucker. Her father, too, recollected breaking her of the habit after it had persisted into her 4th or 5th year. Dora herself had a clear picture of a scene from her early childhood in which she was sitting on the floor in a corner sucking her left thumb and at the same time tugging with her right hand at the lobe of her brother's ear as he sat quietly beside her. Here we have an instance of the complete form of self-gratification by sucking, as it has also been described to me by other patients who had subsequently become anesthetic and hysterical. One of these patients gave me a piece of information which sheds a clear light on the origin of this curious habit. The young woman had never broken herself of the habit of sucking. She retained a memory of her childhood, dating back, according to her, to the first half of her 2nd year, in which she saw herself sucking at her nurse's breast and at the same time pulling rhythmically at the lobe of her nurse's ear. No one will feel inclined to dispute, I think, that the mucous membrane of the lips and mouth is to be regarded as a primary erotogenic zone, since it preserves this earlier significance in the act of kissing, which is looked upon as normal. An intense activity of this erotogenic zone at an early age thus determines the subsequent presence of a somatic compliance on the part of the tract of mucous membrane which begins at the lips. Thus, at a time when the sexual object proper, that is, the male organ, has already become known, circumstances may arise which once more increase the excitation of the oral zone, whose erotogenic character has, as we have seen, been retained. It then needs very little creative power to substitute the sexual object of the moment, the penis, for the original object, the nipple, or for the finger, which does duty for it, and to place the current sexual object in the situation in which gratification was originally obtained. So we see that this excessively repulsive and perverted fantasy of sucking at a penis has the most innocent origin. It is a new version of what may be described as a prehistoric impression of sucking at the mother's or nurse's breast, an impression which has usually been revived by contact with children who are being nursed. In most instances, a cow's udder has aptly played the part of an image intermediate between a nipple and a penis. Dora's incessant repetition of the same thoughts about her father's relations with Frau K. made it possible to derive still further important material from the analysis. A train of thought such as this may be described as excessively intense, or better, reinforced, or supervalent, überwältig, in Wernicke's 1900 sense. It shows its pathological character in spite of its apparently reasonable content, by the single peculiarity that no amount of conscious and voluntary effort of thought on the patient's part is able to dissipate or remove it. A normal train of thought, however intense it may be, can eventually be disposed of. Dora felt, quite rightly, that her thoughts about her father required to be judged in a special way. "I can think of nothing else," she complained again and again. "I know my brother says we children have no right to criticize this behavior of father's. He declares that we ought not to trouble ourselves about it, and not even to be glad, perhaps, that he has found a woman he can love, since mother understands him so little. I can quite see that, and I should like to think the same as my brother, but I can't. I can't forgive him for it." Now, what is one to do in the face of a supervalent thought like this, after one has heard what its conscious grounds are and listened to the ineffectual protests made against it? Reflection will suggest that this excessively intense train of thought must owe its reinforcement to the unconscious. It cannot be resolved by any effort of thought, either because it itself reaches with its root down into the unconscious, repressed material, or because another unconscious thought lies concealed behind it. In the latter case, the concealed thought is usually the direct contrary of the supervalent one. Contrary thoughts are always closely connected with each other, and are often paired off in such a way that the one thought is excessively, intensely conscious, while its counterpart is repressed and unconscious. This relation between the two thoughts is an effect of the process of repression, for repression is often achieved by means of an excessive reinforcement of the thought contrary to the one which is to be repressed. This process I call reactive reinforcement, and the thought which asserts itself with excessive intensity in consciousness, and, in the same way as a prejudice cannot be removed, I call a reactive thought. The two thoughts then act towards each other much like the two needles of an astatic galvanometer. The reactive thought keeps the objectionable one under oppression by means of a certain surplus of intensity, but for that reason it itself is damped and proof against conscious efforts of thought. So that the way to deprive the excessively intense thought of its reinforcement is by bringing its repressed contrary into consciousness. We must also be prepared to meet with instances in which the supervalence of a thought is due not to the presence of one only of these two causes, but to a concurrence of both of them. Other complications, too, may arise, but they can easily be fitted into the general scheme. Let us now apply our theory to the instance provided by Dora's case. We will begin with the first hypothesis, namely that her preoccupation with her father's relations to Frau K. owed its obsessive character to the fact that its root was unknown to her and lay in the unconscious. It is not difficult to divine the nature of that root from her circumstances and her conduct. Her behavior obviously went far beyond what would have been appropriate to filial concern. She felt and acted more like a jealous wife, in a way which would have been comprehensible in her mother. By her ultimatum to her father, either her or me, by the scenes she used to make, by the suicidal intention she allowed to transpire, by all this she was clearly putting herself in her mother's place. If we have rightly guessed the nature of the imaginary sexual situation which underlay her cough, in that fantasy she must have been putting herself in Frau K.'s place. She was therefore identifying herself both with the woman her father had once loved, and with the woman he loved now. The inference is obvious that her affection for her father was a much stronger one than she knew or than she would have cared to admit. In fact, that she was in love with him. I have learnt to look upon unconscious love relations like this, which are marked by their abnormal consequences between a father and a daughter, or between a mother and a son, as a revival of germs of feeling in infancy. Distinct traces are probably to be found in most people of an early partiality of this kind, on the part of a daughter for her father, or on the part of a son for his mother, but it must be assumed to be more intense from the very first, in the case of those children whose constitution marks them down for a neurosis, who develop prematurely and have a craving for love. At this point, certain other influences, which need not be discussed here, come into play, and lead to a fixation of this rudimentary feeling of love, or to a reinforcement of it, so that it turns into something, either while the child is still young, or not until it has reached the age of puberty, which must be put on a par with a sexual inclination, and which, like the latter, has the forces of the libido at its command. The external circumstances of our patient were by no means unfavorable to such an assumption. The nature of her disposition has always drawn her towards her father, and his numerous illnesses were bound to have increased her affection for him. In some of these illnesses he would allow no one but her to discharge the lighter duties of nursing. He had been so proud of the early growth of her intelligence that he had made her his confidant while she was still a child. It was really she, and not her mother, whom Frau K's appearance had driven out of more than one position. When I told Dora that I could not avoid supposing that her affection for her father must, at a very early moment, have amounted to her being completely in love with him, she, of course, gave me her usual reply. I don't remember that. But she immediately went on to tell me something analogous about a 7-year-old girl who was her cousin on her mother's side, and in whom she often thought she saw a kind of reflection of her own childhood. The little girl had, not for the first time, been the witness of a heated dispute between her parents, and, when Dora happened to come in on a visit soon afterwards, whispered in her ear, "You can't think how I hate that person," pointing to her mother. "And when she's dead, I shall marry Daddy." I am in the habit of regarding associations such as this, which bring forward something that agrees with the content of an assertion of mine, as a confirmation from the unconscious of what I have said. No other kind of yes can be extracted from the unconscious. There is no such thing at all as an unconscious no. For years on end, she had given no expression to this passion for her father. On the contrary, she had for a long time been on the closest terms with the woman who had supplanted her with her father, and she had actually, as we know from her self-reproaches, facilitated this woman's relations with her father. Her own love for her father had therefore been recently revived. And if so, the question arises to what end this had happened. Clearly as a reactive symptom, so as to suppress something else. Something, that is, that still exercised power in the unconscious. Considering how things stood, I could not help supposing in the first instance that what was suppressed was her love of Herr K. I could not avoid the assumption that she was still in love with him, but that, for unknown reasons, since the scene by the lake, her love had aroused in her violent feelings of opposition, and that the girl had brought forward and reinforced her old affection for her father, in order to avoid any further necessity for paying conscious attention to the love which she had felt in the first years of her girlhood, and which had now become distressing to her. In this way, I gained an insight into a conflict which was well calculated to unhinge the girl's mind. On the one hand, she was filled with regret at having rejected the man's proposal, and with longing for his company and all the little signs of his affection, while on the other hand these feelings of tenderness and longing were combated by powerful forces, amongst which her pride was one of the most obvious. Thus, she had succeeded in persuading herself that she had done with Herr K. That was the advantage she derived from this typical process of repression, and yet she was obliged to summon up her infantile affection for her father, and to exaggerate it, in order to protect herself against the feelings of love which were constantly pressing forward into consciousness. The further fact that she was almost incessantly a prey to the most embittered jealousy seemed to admit of still another determination. My expectations were by no means disappointed when this explanation of mine was met by Dora with a most emphatic negative. The no uttered by a patient after a repressed thought has been presented to his conscious perception for the first time does no more than register the existence of a repression and its severity. It acts, as it were, as a gauge of the repression's strength. If this no, instead of being regarded as the expression of an impartial judgment, of which indeed the patient is incapable, is ignored, and if work is continued, the first evidence soon begins to appear that in such a case no signifies the desired yes. Dora admitted that she found it impossible to be as angry with Herr K. as he had deserved. She told me that one day she had met Herr K. in the street while she was walking with a cousin of hers who did not know him. The other girl had exclaimed all at once, "Why, Dora, what's wrong with you? You've gone as white as a sheet." She herself had felt nothing of this change of color, but I explained to her that the expression of emotion and the play of features obey the unconscious rather than the conscious, and are a means of betraying the former. Another time Dora came to me in the worst of tempers after having been uniformly cheerful for several days. She could give no explanation of this. She felt so contrary today, she said. It was her uncle's birthday, and she could not bring herself to congratulate him. She did not know why. My powers of interpretation were at a low ebb that day. I let her go on talking, and she suddenly recollected that it was her K's birthday too, a fact which I did not fail to use against her. and it was then no longer hard to explain why the handsome present she had had on her own birthday a few days before had given her no pleasure. One gift was missing, and that was Herr K's, the gift which had plainly once been the most prized of all. Nevertheless, Dora persisted in denying my contention for some time longer, until, towards the end of the analysis, the conclusive proof of its correctness came to light. I must now turn to consider a further complication to which I should certainly give no space if I were a man of letters engaged upon the creation of a mental state like this for a short story, instead of being a medical man engaged upon its dissection. The element to which I must now allude can only serve to obscure and efface the outlines of the fine poetic conflict which we have been able to ascribe to Dora. This element would rightly fall a sacrifice to the censorship of a writer, for he, after all, simplifies and abstracts when he appears in the character of a psychologist. But in the world of reality, which I am trying to depict here, a complication of motives, an accumulation and conjunction of mental activities, in a word, overdetermination, is the rule. For behind Dora's supervalent train of thought, which was concerned with her father's relations with Frau K., there lay concealed a feeling of jealousy, which had that lady as its object, a feeling, that is, which could only be based upon an affection on Dora's part for one of her own sex. It has long been known, and often been pointed out, that at the age of puberty boys and girls show clear signs, even in normal cases, of the existence of an affection for people of their own sex. A romantic and sentimental friendship with one of her school friends, accompanied by vows, kisses, promises of eternal correspondence, and all the sensibility of jealousy, is the common precursor of a girl's first serious passion for a man. Thenceforward, in favorable circumstances, the homosexual current of feeling often runs completely dry. But if a girl is not happy in her love for a man, the current is often set flowing again by the libido in later years, and is increased up to a greater or lesser degree of intensity. If this much can be established without difficulty of healthy persons, and if we take into account what has already been said about the fuller development in neurotics of the normal germs of perversion, we shall expect to find in these latter two a fairly strong homosexual predisposition. It must indeed be so, for I have never yet come through a single psychoanalysis of a man or woman without having to take into account a very considerable current of homosexuality. When, in a hysterical woman or girl, the sexual libido, which is directed towards men, has been energetically suppressed, it will regularly be found that the libido which is directed towards women has become vicariously reinforced, and even to some extent conscious. I shall not in this place go any further into this important subject, which is especially indispensable to an understanding of hysteria in men, because Dora's analysis came to an end before I could throw any light on this side of her mental life. But I should like to recall the governess, whom I have already mentioned, and with whom Dora had at first enjoyed the closest interchange of thought, until she discovered that she was being admired and fondly treated not for her own sake, but for her father's, whereupon she had obliged the governess to leave. She used also to dwell with noticeable frequency and a peculiar emphasis on the story of another estrangement which appeared inexplicable even to herself. She had always been on particularly good terms with the younger of her two cousins, the girl who had later on become engaged, and had shared all sorts of secrets with her. When, for the first time after Dora had broken off her stay by the lake, her father was going back to B, she had naturally refused to go with him. This cousin had then been asked to travel with him instead, and she had accepted the invitation. From that time forward, Dora had felt a coldness towards her, and she herself was surprised to find how indifferent she had become, although, as she admitted, she had very little ground for complaints against her. These instances of sensitiveness led me to inquire what her relations with Frau K. had been up till the time of the breach. I then found that the young woman and the scarcely grown girl had lived for years on a footing of the closest intimacy. When Dora stayed with the K's, she used to share a bedroom with Frau K., and the husband used to be quartered elsewhere. She had been the wife's confidant and adviser in all the difficulties of her married life. There was nothing they had not talked about. Medea had been quite content that Creusa should make friends with her 2 children, and she certainly did nothing to interfere with the relations between the girl and the children's father. How Dora managed to fall in love with the man about whom her beloved friend had so many bad things to say is an interesting psychological problem. We shall not be far from solving it when we realize that thoughts in the unconscious live very comfortably side by side, and even contraries get on together without disputes, a state of things which persists often enough, even in the conscious. When Dora talked about Frau K., she used to praise her adorable white body, in accents more appropriate to a lover than to a defeated rival. Another time she told me, more in sorrow than in anger, that she was convinced the presents her father had brought her had been chosen by Frau K., for she recognized her taste. Another time, again, she pointed out that, evidently through the agency of Frau K., she had been given a present of some jewelry, which was exactly like some that she had seen in Frau K.'s possession, and had wished for aloud at the time. Indeed, I can say in general that I never heard her speak a harsh or angry word against the lady, although from the point of view of her supervalent thought, she should have regarded her as the prime author of her misfortunes. She seemed to behave inconsequently, but her apparent inconsequence was precisely the manifestation of a complicating current of feeling. For how had this woman, to whom Dora was so enthusiastically devoted, behaved to her? After Dora had brought forward her accusation against Herr K., and her father had written to him and had asked for an explanation, Herr K. had replied in the first instance by protesting sentiments of the highest esteem for her, and by proposing that he should come to the manufacturing town to clear up every misunderstanding. A few weeks later, when her father spoke to him at B, there was no longer any question of esteem. On the contrary, Herr K. spoke of her with disparagement, and produced as his trump card the reflection that no girl who read such books and was interested in such things could have any title to a man's respect. Frau K., therefore, had betrayed her and had calumniated her, for it had only been with her that she had read Mantegazza and discussed forbidden topics. It was a repetition of what had happened with the governess. Frau K. had not loved her for her own sake, but on account of her father. Frau K. had sacrificed her without a moment's hesitation so that her relations with her father might not be disturbed. This mortification touched her, perhaps, more nearly, and had a greater pathogenic effect than the other one, which she tried to use as a screen for it, the fact that she had been sacrificed by her father. Did not the obstinacy with which she retained the particular amnesia concerning the sources of her forbidden knowledge point directly to the great emotional importance for her of the accusation against her upon that score, and consequently to her betrayal by her friend? I believe, therefore, that I am not mistaken in supposing that Dora's supervalent train of thought, which was concerned with her father's relations with Frau K., was designed not only for the purpose of suppressing her love for Herr K., which had once been conscious, but also to conceal her love for Frau K., which was, in a deeper sense, unconscious. The supervalent train of thought was directly contrary to the latter current of feeling. She told herself incessantly that her father had sacrificed her to this woman, and made noisy demonstrations to show that she grudged her the possession of her father. And in this way she concealed from herself the contrary fact, which was that she grudged her father Frau K.'s love, and had not forgiven the woman she loved for the disillusionment she had been caused by her betrayal. The jealous emotions of a woman were linked in the inconscious with a jealousy such as might have been felt by a man. These masculine, or, more properly speaking, gynecophilic currents of feeling are to be regarded as typical of the unconscious erotic life of hysterical girls.